Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. So I've reviewed several mini PCs here on this channel. I really love working with these little guys. Now this one here was actually sent to me by Beelink, and it is called the SER3. Now this is a new Ryzen 7 PC. And unlike some of the other budget mini PCs that I've reviewed here on this channel, this one's actually pretty good. And so because it has these nicer specs, I have different expectations for this product. And that is, I'm actually curious to find out whether or not it could function as a PC replacement. If you go to the Beelink website, you can see it retails for about $600 for the low-end model, with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage. The upgraded version with 16 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage is $689. And that's a significant amount of money. But luckily, the high-end version is on Amazon and it's listed for much lower, $559 plus a $45 off coupon. And I think this $515 price point is actually pretty fair when you look at what you get with it. On their website, they do a pretty good job of explaining everything that you can expect from this. For example, it supports triple monitors with 4K 60Hz output, and it runs a Ryzen 7 3750H, which is a fairly good CPU. And in addition to the M.2 NVMe storage, it actually has a slot for your own hard drive if you want to add that as well. So taking a quick look at the specs here, you can see that the clock speed of the CPU is between 2.3 and 4 GHz, and it has 4 cores and 8 threads. It also runs Vega 10 integrated graphics, and it can go all the way up to 64 gigabytes, and the NVMe can support 512 gigs. So all in all, I think these are pretty good specs, and that leads me to think that maybe, yeah, this could function as a pretty fairly good everyday computer. And so that's what we're going to focus on in this video here. We're going to focus mostly on gaming and retro game emulation, but in the end, I'm really just curious whether or not that $515 price point is going to be worth it considering today's environment. So we got a lot of ground to cover. I'm going to try my hardest to keep this under 20 minutes, so without any further delay, let's jump into it. So like I mentioned before, Beelink sent me this to review, and all opinions are my own. They're not seeing this video before I release it. Even the box itself is fairly small with this device. It comes with a user manual that doesn't have a lot of information in it, it just identifies which ports do what. So let's have a look at the device itself, and first impressions, this thing is tiny. It's hard to believe that this is a fully functioning and fairly powerful computer. On the front you have two USB 3.0 ports, a USB-C port, and then the headphone and microphone jack. And the enclosure itself is 100% metal, and there's a lot of ventilation. It looks really nice and sleek. On the back you have more exhaust vents, as well as Gigabit Ethernet, two USB 3.0s, two HDMI, and then your power plug. On the bottom has two rubberized feet, and then also has the quick setting buttons for when you're booting up the device. I think that's pretty handy. Okay, let's see what else is in the box. We have an HDMI cable, the power adapter, as well as a smaller HDMI cable in case you want to plug this directly into your monitor. And here's a mount to put it on the back of your monitor. You've also got a fair amount of screws here to plug in the VESA mount, and it looks like maybe for a hard drive as well. In terms of size, it's about the size of an Xbox controller. It's pretty surprisingly small. But just in case you don't have an Xbox controller, it's about twice the size of Kerrygold Pure Irish Butter. So if you've got two butters lying around, then you can put them together and get an idea for how big this thing is. One note here is the AC adapter is actually pretty big compared to the device itself, so something to keep in mind. Now one thing I wanted to test with this PC is the hard drive enclosure inside. So I bought a 1TB solid state drive. We're going to install this before we get started. And this is going to allow us to increase the storage capacity of the device, or we could also use that as a secondary operating system. For example, we could put Batocera on this solid state drive and then boot to that at will. And luckily, the device has been designed to be easily modified. The hard drive enclosure is actually already wired up. And just to verify here, this is running dual channel RAM, 8 GB each, DDR4, 2666. And here's the M.2 NVMe storage, 512 gigs. So overall, it's a pretty clean design. Underneath is the CPU fan. I didn't get that far into it, but I do like what I see at least here. Alright, so now let's install that hard drive. This is a 1TB solid state drive. I got it for about $80 on Amazon. And installing it is super easy. You literally just slide it into the slot here and then push down until it clicks. And that's it, it's now installed. You could use some screws on the side to hold it in place, but it's really firmly in there. So let's go ahead and close up the enclosure using these 4 Phillips screws again. And there we are, right as rain. All in all, I'm pretty happy with this setup. Many mini PCs are hard to modify, this one was fairly easy. One of the things I like about this device as well is that all of the ports that I want to have access to easily are the ones on the front. And many times, a lot of companies don't really think this through well. Luckily, this one isn't the case. So yeah, overall impressions of this hardware, I think it looks like a really nice mini PC. In fact, even Chicken is kind of excited about it. Now, she also happens to be hungry while I was filming this, and that's why she's a little excited looking, but all the same, she seems to like it. And to give you an idea of what it looks like, here it is on my desk. And honestly, it fits really well next to my keyboard. It's hard to believe this is a computer. In fact, as you can see, the Mac Mini is significantly larger than this thing. Even my little mini audio receiver is like huge compared to this thing. It's kind of crazy. Another thing to mention, this device runs fairly cool as well as mostly silent. It's very rare that I actually hear the fans kick in. That's a good sign. So yeah, overall, if you're tight on space, this might be a good option. Okay, let's actually check out the software now. We're going to boot it up and see how it goes. Now this comes installed with Windows 10, but it is Windows 11 compatible. That being said, I have not switched over with this. And once you've set up Windows, you can verify here that I have the local storage as well as the solid state drive that I installed myself. So I have access to both of these drives. We'll do a quick look at the computer itself, and as you can see, the CPU and the RAM and the Windows version, all of that seems to be correct. Now, I'm not one to do a lot of benchmarking with devices like this. I honestly just don't know how to do that with PCs. But if you are interested in seeing how these things perform, then I would recommend checking out this channel here, Tech Tablets. They did a full review of this device. So I'll leave a link to his video in the description below, in case you want to get a better idea of the benchmarks. But in this video, I want to focus more on just the real world and practical use of this computer. Like, what would you do if you actually owned it? And you know, with the 16 gigabytes of RAM in the model that I'm testing, it does feel nice and zippy. In fact, it feels just as zippy as the main PC that I use. Browsing through websites seems to be nice and fast. And you could definitely use this as something like a home office PC. I think it runs spreadsheets and things like that really well. So yeah, I think this would work pretty well as a home office computer. Honestly, I don't think you'd want to do any sort of video editing on it, but all the same, it does seem to be nice and snappy. So let's get into some exciting things like video games. I've already loaded up Steam here, so I'm going to install a couple games, and I've already configured the settings to basically run everything at 1080p. I'm not going to go beyond that. I'm going to try to get the best gameplay I can at the standard 1080p definition. Honestly, a lot of the games that are in my current Steam catalog are a result of the fact that I'm anticipating playing these on the Steam Deck. And it turns out that the games that I thought were going to play really well on the Steam Deck, things like Hades, are also really good on this too. On the top left, I'm running a frame rate counter, and as you can see, it's running at a solid 60 frames per second at 1080p at the default settings. Moving it up a bit, here's Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and this is also running at 1080p in the default settings. The FPS is on the top right here, and it does dip below 60 frames per second here and there, but overall the gameplay is relatively smooth. So I would consider this game to be entirely playable too. In fact, it was a very enjoyable experience as I was playing it through. Now, I don't have a ton of high-end games on my Steam catalog, but I do have the Master Chief Collection, and as you can see here, Halo 4 is playing surprisingly well. I did alter the settings down to medium settings instead of the accurate settings that were initially put on there. But overall, 1080p gameplay seems to run fairly well. It's not 60 frames per second constantly, but honestly, the dips that it did have were relatively painless. So I would say this computer actually runs fairly well as a casual gaming PC. You wouldn't really want to play Cyberpunk on this, but most of the other games are going to play pretty good. So now let's try out emulation using Windows emulators. We'll start with PS2 just because that generally seems to be the most problematic with a lot of these mid-range PCs. And I tested quite a few games, but honestly the best reflection of PS2 performance is typically going to be God of War 2. And that's because right at the beginning of this game, you're going to see a lot of intense combat, which tends to slow the game down. Now I'm running the PAL version of this, so it's going to cap out at 50 frames per second, but as you can see here, even at native PS2 resolution, it's not keeping up at the full 50 frames per second. And if we try to increase the resolution to just double the resolution, you can see the frame rate drops even more. So that's kind of a bummer, but I would say that PS2 is going to be quite a challenge for this little mini PC. So I wanted to get the bad out first. Let's go over to some of the things that actually play well. For example, GameCube plays really well, even when upscaled to 1080p resolution. As you can see here, Legend of Zelda Wind Waker is playing just fine. I also tried out a few others. For example, here's Prince of Persia Sands of Time, and it's pretty funny. I remember this being such exciting combat. Turns out it's not quite as exciting as I remembered. And of course, probably your best benchmark for GameCube emulation is going to be F-Zero GX, and as you can see here, it's running at a super solid 60 frames per second at 1080p. So when it comes to GameCube, this thing has no problem. Moving along, here's PSP. We're running at a 4x resolution, which is 1080p, and it's running flawlessly as well. Outrun 2006 is one of the harder games to play on the PSP, and the fact that it's running so well is a really nice indicator of good performance. And of course, the upper limit for PSP is typically God of War Chains of Olympus, and as you can see, this one at 4x resolution is running at almost full speed. Every once in a while, I see a frame dip down to like say 57 or even 54 frames per second, but it quickly catches up, and overall, it's a very smooth experience. I'd be completely comfortable playing this game in 1080p. Okay, we're still recovering from that kind of crappy PS2 performance, but let me brighten your spirits a little bit with Wii U. I would see hiccups here and there, mostly when I was compiling new shaders, but overall it runs really well. Not all of them are perfect, I'll show off some Breath of the Wild here later in this video, but your average Wii U games do play really well. Okay, moving over to Nintendo Switch, some of these games do play at full speed, but to be honest, it was mostly 2D games, so things like Celeste, they're going to play no problem. And Metroid Dread was pretty smooth too. Now, it wasn't at full speed the entire time, but it was definitely playable and enjoyable. However, if you try to play a 3D game, something like Super Mario Odyssey, it just doesn't play at full speed. But to be fair, I have a pretty powerful regular PC, and it doesn't play this one very well either. This is just a pretty hard game to emulate. Okay, so moving forward here, if you remember a couple months ago, I did a video about how to load up Batocera on a flash drive. The idea behind this is that you put the operating system and the games on one flash drive and then plug that into any PC and you'll be able to load it up. Now, this is kind of a simplistic way of looking at things, but all in all, it actually works fairly well. And so what I wanted to do was plug in this exact flash drive into this PC and see how it performed too. And in case you haven't seen that video, it's as simple as just plugging in the flash drive and then opening up the recovery options section in your computer, and then going to the advanced startup and pressing the Restart Now button. This will give you a bunch of different options for booting. You'll want to go to the Use a Device section and then select the UEFI USB partition. From there, the PC will reboot and it'll load up Batocera instead of Windows. Now this is running Batocera 32, which as of making this video is the most recent version of Batocera. And to be honest, I love this user interface. I love being able to just navigate through your games using a controller like this. It's just a lot of fun. Now this flash drive method is not 100% required. For example, you could load up Batocera on an SD card, or I could even use that 1TB solid state drive that I installed on this PC to just function as its own retro emulating system. When it comes down to it, you have several different options, but I do kind of like the idea of having Batocera on that internal drive, because then I'd be able to separate my home office functions from the retro gaming side of this device. So that being said, let's look at how performance works on the Batocera side, especially compared to the Windows side. So we'll run through the games list again. We'll start with Nintendo GameCube. And so, starting off with F-Zero GX, this one is running at a really good frame rate. It does dip down to say 58 or 59 frames per second every once in a while, but honestly, if I didn't see the numbers at the top right, I wouldn't notice at all. GameCube will run really well on this device, either on Batocera or the Windows side. In fact, as I was testing out Metroid Prime, I found myself playing the game for almost an hour just because I was having that much fun with it. So GameCube at 1080p, no problem. Let's move over to Nintendo Wii. Now this one I actually set to 720p instead of 1080p, and it's still running really well. Now like with GameCube, I would see it dip down every once in a while on some of the harder games, but overall I would say that the Nintendo Wii is completely playable on this, even upscaled to 720p. Now here's Zemu, which is the Xbox emulator, and unfortunately it doesn't run very well. Now there's a lot of things going on the screen right here, and honestly Xbox itself used to slow down at this part of the game anyway, but unfortunately this doesn't show your frame rate in this emulator, so we just kind of have to get a guess, and unfortunately it's just not super fast. Another one that doesn't play very well is the Citra emulator. This is for the Nintendo 3DS. This one seems to run at about 45 frames per second, so not so great. And moving over to Cemu, the Wii U emulator, this one seems to run just a little bit worse than it did on Windows. You do get 60 frames per second in a lot of the smaller areas, but when you expand the scope to some of the larger areas in this game, it does dip down quite a bit, even down to below 50 frames per second. But you know, overall it was actually fairly enjoyable. I got used to the lag as I was playing through some of those larger parts. On the other hand, some games like Wind Waker HD just was completely unplayable. We're getting about 15 frames per second, so that's not very good at all. Now one spot that I did find surprising is that PS2 emulation on Batocera was actually better than I got on the Windows side. As you can see here, I'm getting a pretty stable frame rate. It's around 50 frames per second. I do see it dip down to 48, 47 here and there, and it's only a native resolution, but overall it's running much faster than it did on the Windows side. So I'd say all in all, if you don't mind having a little bit of frame dips here and there and running PS2 at a native resolution, it seems like the tweaks they've done in Batocera actually make this pretty darn playable. So it definitely does have potential when it comes to playing PS2. Now, a couple years ago, I ended up taking a Dell Optiplex and putting new components in it and then giving it to my son, and this is his primary computer here. It's an Optiplex 3020 with an i5 chip, and all I really did is add a GeForce GT 1030 low-profile GPU, as well as 16 gigs of RAM and then a solid-state hard drive. The computer itself cost me $100 and it cost about $200 for all the additional components. And I think you could probably do the same nowadays, although the GPU is now like $150, so I'd expect to pay something between $350 and $400 to set this up yourself. And so for the last part of this video here, I want to compare my son's computer with its dedicated graphics card against this mini PC. And honestly, I didn't have huge expectations when it came to this performance against the Dell. To be honest, there's a lot of concessions you have to make with a small form factor like this, and even though it costs about $150, $200 more than the Dell put together, I'm still curious to see how this all plays out. Now, my son is a huge fan of Minecraft. That's basically the only game he plays on this computer, and so we're going to use that as our benchmark. And starting with his computer, we're running the Windows version of Minecraft here, and it's a stable 60 frames per second. This is running at 1080p on the default settings, no tweaks or anything added here. Now that being said, my son doesn't play the Windows version of Minecraft, he plays the Java version. I didn't even realize there were two versions of it. But anyway, this is the version he runs, and it's also at default settings at 1080p. But as you can see, the frame rate is through the roof on this. Now the monitor he plays on only can run at 60 Hz, so it's not like he's actually seeing all these frames, but all the same, it's a good indication of how well this plays. In fact, he often plays with this HD skin on top of Minecraft, and as you can see here, it's running at about 40 frames per second. And so even with this high resolution skin, it's still running relatively well. Now he does a tiny bit of emulation, but mostly he sticks with Breath of the Wild here. Here it's upscaled to 1080p, and you can see we're getting about 25 frames per second. Now that's not super good performance, but then again, running this game at 1080p does take a lot of juice. Okay, so now let's switch over to the mini PC and run these same three games and see how they do. We'll start with the Windows version of Minecraft. And right off the bat, we can already see that the performance is not as good. As you see on the top left here, it's getting 60 frames per second every once in a while, but for the most part, it's running at 55, sometimes even under 50 frames per second. So that's a night and day comparison between the steady 60 frames that we were getting on his other computer. And then, moving over to the Java version here, you can see that it also is not getting even 60 frames per second. I'd say about 30 is the average. So unfortunately, as much as I was hoping to maybe give this to him for Christmas as like an upgrade to his current PC, it looks like that's not going to be happening. He's not going to be happy if I switch out his computer for this one. And same thing here, we're running Breath of the Wild Wii U on the Windows side with 720p native resolution, and it's struggling to get up to 25 frames per second. So overall, this mini PC just can't compare to even a Dell Optiplex with a dedicated graphics card. It's not a huge bummer to me because I'm pretty amazed at what this thing can do, but all the same, I wanted to give you some reasonable expectations. Okay, so wrapping things up here, let's go over what I like first. And number one, this thing looks beautiful. It's sleek and it has this all metal case. It's really nice looking on my desk. The device is also quiet. You rarely hear the fan spin up, and it's nice and small. As we saw earlier, it's very easy to upgrade this. Getting inside is just a matter of pulling off 4 screws, and you can upgrade your RAM as well as your M.2 NVMe storage, as well as add your own solid state drive. And I appreciate that this computer can run 3 displays. You have 2 HDMI outputs, and you can also use the USB-C for video output as well. All 3 of them run at 4K with 60 Hz. And as we saw earlier, this is very Batocera friendly. You can either use the internal SATA drive, or you could use a USB drive, or even a flash drive like I showed in this video. And overall, I would say this device is pretty good for moderate or casual PC gaming. You're not going to be able to play the latest AAA titles very well, but all the same, you're going to be able to play 95% of the games in the Steam library anyway. And finally, as we saw, this does have some decent 1080p retro game emulation. Obviously, some systems run better than others, but overall, I was happy with this performance. Okay, so that's everything I like about the device. Now, what are some of the things that I don't like about it? To be honest, there's not a ton of things I don't like about it, but this is what I came up with. Number one, this thing uses Bluetooth 4.0, and I think they really just cut corners on this, and it's really unfortunate. You know, honestly, when I used a Bluetooth mouse, I could tell a little bit of input lag when I was using a mouse, and that really shouldn't happen. So honestly, if you're thinking about getting this device, I would expect to use either a wired mouse or one of those that have a USB dongle. And you know, a lot of the specs on this device are pretty good, and one of the missteps I think is the fact that it doesn't have Wi-Fi 6. You know, with all the other different additions to it, Wi-Fi 6 would have been a really good complement. That being said, Ethernet works really well. One thing I wish that this device had was a bare bones option, that it didn't come with a hard drive or RAM. That way, if you wanted to add the most storage and RAM as possible, you wouldn't have to pay for any RAM in the first place. And that ends up making it a really consumer-friendly deal, and it's unfortunate that they didn't have that option available. And as we saw in the emulation department, you know, PS2 and some Wii U and Switch just didn't play very well. In general, if you can play 2D games on Wii U and Switch, they're going to be great. But PS2 tended to be hit and miss. And it's surprising that the tweaks in Batocera actually made the performance better than it does in Windows. And finally, this just needs to be said, but you know, the fact that this has such a small form factor does carry a higher price tag. And that's not to say that this isn't a good value. I think that if you wanted to use a mini PC, this is actually a really great value. But overall, if you want to spend $515, you could get a better computer. Of course, it's going to be much larger and you'll have to use used components and things like that. But all the same, I did want to bring the fact up is that you are going to pay $515 for a computer that you could get cheaper, albeit in a larger form factor. Okay, really that's everything for this video. When it comes down to it, do I think this computer is worth the $515 that are listed on Amazon right now? I would say that at that price point, if you're looking for a mini PC, you want something with a very small form factor, and you want something that's pre-built, then yes, I would say this is a pretty good value. I think I would be happy using this as a primary computer as long as I didn't need to do video editing or high-end emulation. For use in a home office as well as a casual gaming PC, I think this is actually a really good value, especially if you're short on space. But if you're looking to get the best performance for the price, then you're probably going to be best off getting a used PC and adding your own components. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I'm interested to hear what you think about this little PC. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.